If your ground contact time is too low, you could potentially reduce some of the benefits of your body to benefit from that passive nature, returning what you've absorbed in that absorption phase of stance. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Run DNA podcast. Doug Adams here. And the episode today is Mastering Your Stride, the science of ground contact time. Another exciting one, and this is another part of our wearable device series and how to use it and what information you can get out of it. I think this is an interesting one, particularly for me. This has some implications from some of my past research, and I think it's something that has become widespread, and I think it's something that people will often know, and it's easier to comprehend, but knowing the implications of it and knowing how to affect it are different. And I think that that's what we really want to focus on, not just what it is, but how you can impact it, whether you should worry about it, and if you want more information, where you can go from there. So we're going to dive in and start talking just about understanding a little bit more ground contact time and what it is. So when we run, there's often many phases of running that we talk about, but in the simplest terms, we can say there's stance phase and swing phase. So the percentage of time or the amount of time that you spend on the ground is often your stance phase. And the ground contact time is just basically another term for stance phase, how long your foot is on the ground. And we'll define this in left versus right. And we'll look to see how long that is and is there symmetry with that. And I think this has become a much more popular metric, maybe not as popular as something like cadence, but it is something that has become more widespread amongst runners because there's implications of how ground contact time might be related to performance, injury risk, and we're going to talk about some of those things today here. So we start talking about it first. I think it's important to understand whether we can trust what we're getting. So the way that a wearable device calculates ground contact time is important to understand and how reliable it is. And it's important to understand that the reliability between devices may not be as good, but within device, it should be pretty good. And that's, if we look here, I did a study back in 2018, which seems like a lifetime ago now, but IJSBT, we talked about altering cadence or vertical oscillation during running, effects on running-related injury factors, but this was part of a 2-article series. We had done another article in 2016. But what those 2 articles were really looking at was the ability to see if the metrics that we were getting from the watch, specifically vertical oscillation, ground contact time, cadence, if those were reliable and valid measures, because we've got a really powerful device on our wrist now that gives us a lot of basic information. So what we found is that the reliability was good with the ground contact time, but the accuracy and validity wasn't quite as high. And I'll tell you that's very true with my own running. A lot of you know I do a lot of gait analysis. I am always using myself as a guinea pig, and I'm doing a gait analysis. And when I run with my wearable device, I am often seeing ground contact times at, say, 240 to 260 range, and that unit of measurement is in milliseconds. So the typical ground contact time that we're looking for is 200 to 220 or lower. So lower is often better. We'll give a little more about that later on here. But typically a lower number is better. And we should be shooting for that 200 to 220 range, depending on your speed. For a typical recreational runner, the pros will be in the 150, 160 range, depending on the event and the distance that they're running and the speed that they're at. But ground contact time is often significantly lower in our professional division. So the way that the watch calculates that is looking for periods of peaks in acceleration. So the way the wearable technology works is they often have accelerometers in them, and they're looking for accelerations or changes in that accelerometer. So it's pretty easy to determine the point at which the foot hits the ground. Determining the point at which the foot comes off the ground is often more challenging. And this is basically a line drawn in the sand by the wearable device company that they detected a certain way. And that is why you will see a difference between using a Garmin versus a Coros versus an Apple Watch versus a 3D motion analysis. The 3D motion analysis is obviously going to be the gold standard with this. And to give you some context, when I'm at that 240 to 260 with my wearable device, when I do a gait analysis, I'm in the 200 to 215 range, depending on the speed. So there is a pretty significant difference with this, and it's something that we should be aware of. But if we're using our devices, and I think this is a theme of this whole wearable device series, is that we should have a baseline understanding of what we are doing as we're running, and then be able to get more information and compare across baseline. And are we improving this number? Is it getting higher? Is it getting lower? And that's an important aspect of it as we're understanding this. So if you go for a run, most of the devices now will have ground contact time. Even some of the more base models here will include this metrics. You used to have to wear the heart rate strap for this, but I think a lot of this is wrist-based now. Depending on which device you're using, you still might get a little more accurate from the heart rate based, but the wrist based is still able to do that. What I encourage people is to really make sure when they run to tighten up the strap, not too tight, but tighten up the strap on your watch to make sure that you're limiting the amount of bounce. I found personally that the faster I run, or the more I run on trails or uneven terrain, some of those metrics become less reliable because of the amount of motion of the watch as I'm running. So if you're looking to measure this metric, make sure that you're tightening that watch strap up pretty well so that it's not moving around too much. So we found that this number was reliable. The validity was close, but not great, kind of like we just discussed about, but it is more of a reliable things here. So now what does it mean, and should we really be paying attention to this? I think there's a growing body of evidence around this, but we still need some more answers. We still need to find out some more information about how does this relate to our efficiency? How does this relate to running injury risk, performance? It's pretty well seen that a lower ground contact time can be a correlation, is not causation, but it can be seen in faster runners. And that makes sense. The less time on the ground, the less forces you're absorbing. So it is a important measurement here. We'll see recreational runners will have much higher amounts. And some of this is related to a term that we call stiffness. And we see stiffness is a measurement that we use in our 3D system. And it is the simplest way to explain is how springy you are. So if you have a high amount of stiffness, you will not go through a lot of motion, and your body is quickly getting off and on the ground. So you're getting a lot of passive return from some of the forces that you're absorbing, and you're able to return those into forward propulsion. A lower amount of stiffness means that you go through more motion, and you might have to have more of an active component to running to get that same forward propulsion. So stiffness, again, is another metric that we're still understanding and researching, but it's one I have looked at in thousands of gait analysis that I've done now. And the stiffness is more of a performative metric that we're looking to see that when the stiffness is higher, that we will see that often improved performance, improved mechanics, taking advantage of some of the passive natures of our anatomy so that we can get a little more running economy and running efficiency. And I'll see a pretty strong correlation of this where when the stiffness goes up, it's often the ground contact time is going down. So we're looking at some of those relationships of how ground contact time relates to other metrics as well that we might be looking at. There could even be, there's some, you'll see vertical ratio a lot of times on your dashboards from your wearable devices now, and that is looking more to normalize the amount of your bounce up and down. We'll do probably a whole nother episode on vertical oscillation, but it's looking to normalize that bounce based off of your stride length. And again, that can be loosely related to ground contact time, because if you have a longer stride, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes that means you're on the ground for a little longer unless you're increasing your flight time. So don't want to get too nerdy about some of this stuff here. There could be a lot that we could go into and even to discuss more. But I found an interesting study that was pretty recent. I'm going to butcher the name, so I apologize in advance. Joubert in 2020. Sorry about that. But Joubert 2020 here. I'll bring it up on the screen so that people can interpret how to pronounce the name on their own and see the reference as well. But this was an interesting study that looked at ground contact time imbalances and how that related to impaired running economy. A novel approach to it. I really like this article. I think they did a nice job. I will say that the sample size was a little bit small with only 11 runners. So we have to interpret this with a bit of a grain of salt, but I think that it is something intuitively that makes sense, but probably some need for some further expanded studies on it. But I wanted to highlight a couple things from this study and why we should pay attention to ground contact time and maybe what you should look for. Maybe, if you're a recreational runner that's running in the 10 to 12 minute mile here, 200 to 220 milliseconds might not be very obtainable for you, but you might want to look at something more along symmetry. And what this study showed is that an approximate 3.7 increase in metabolic cost for every 1% increase in ground contact time imbalance across runners. So that's an interesting finding, that if you see a 1% increase in your ground contact time on one side versus the other, that means 3.7% increase in metabolic cost. And the article did a nice job of explaining this kind of in so what. They said for a runner that's about 154, 155 pounds here, this would equate to 105 more kilocalories of increased energy expenditure in a marathon for each of that 1% imbalance. So, with this 175 pound or 150 pound, 5-pound runner, if they had a 3% imbalance there, they would burn an additional 315 calories for the marathon. That's a pretty interesting finding here, because you think about when we're talking about this in milliseconds, there's not a huge difference. A 1%, if you're looking at somebody that is at 200 milliseconds for easy math here, that's not a big difference here. We're looking at just a couple of fractions of a millisecond here, or just a few milliseconds here, fractions of a second, that really make a big difference in somebody's efficiency with running here. So if we're seeing that inefficiency, that's going to add up, and that this might not directly speak to injuries from this, but it might speak about performance, and we might see some asymmetrical use of energy. And there was some speculations in the article, although nothing was definitely studied with this. They did take some circumference measurements of the limbs to try to see if there was a difference in muscle mass size. But what they were basically speculating a bit is that if there's changes in the muscle activations or changes in the muscle strength or size, that could contribute to some of these muscle asymmetries, and why there is a running economy deficit for them, because one side might be working harder to try to keep up with the other side, and there might be those imbalances. So I definitely need more studies on that. That's not something that we can make a hard, fast conclusion about why there is an increased metabolic demand, but we can say that if you do notice a left-right balance, that would be, in the example that they had from the article, 51.5 ground contact time on the right and 48.5 ground contact time on the left. That could be 315 more calories for the marathon. So I don't know if anyone wants to suck down an extra 3 gels during a marathon there at about 100 calories a gel. And that could be a little tough on the tummy there. So we'll have to consider that. And additionally, they brought in the stiffness as well, that the decreased leg stiffness has been linked to increased ground contact time and impaired running economy. So there's just some articles supporting what we were talking about earlier about the stiffness factor. So I think that, that really is an interesting finding, that even small percentages can have an increase, 2 or 3%. And if you're looking at your data, and you're seeing some of those numbers, might not seem like a big difference, but that can add up over time. And that's why it really is important to get a gait analysis and make sure that you're understanding why that's happening. A lot of these wearable devices and kind of the lower level technology that's giving some of these spatiotemporal data here, that tells you a lot about what's going on, but as it doesn't really give you an idea of why it's happening. So if you do notice these, I'm going to give you some advice for improving ground contact time and improving ground contact time balance. But I think it's also important to stress that you should get a gait analysis with the highest level that is in your capabilities and your resources. If you can get a 3D gait analysis, it would be definitely helpful to understand why these ground contact time balances are happening and what might be contributing to it, and matching this up with your strength and your flexibility so that you have a plan of how to address it. In the short term, just giving you some thoughts, if you're healthy to do so, some actionable tips on how to improve your ground contact time. I think there's a talk we could talk about cadence here, where if we increase cadence, we should reduce the time on the ground. So that is something, but I urge people that don't just start increasing your cadence if you don't know what you're doing. I think I've seen many runners come in to see me because they've just said, "Oh yeah, I'll just increase my cadence," and they're not really sure how or why they're doing this, and that can lead to some other trouble. So I wouldn't say just like go out and up your cadence by 5 to 10%. That could have some other implications with it. What I would say from a metronome and a cadence standpoint might be better is if you notice that asymmetry, observing what your cadence is, and then doing cadence retraining that sees if you can try to get more symmetry with it, where it's left, right, left, right, left, right with a metronome, and making sure that you're getting a symmetrical pattern with the metronome, and just setting it at your current cadence, whatever that cadence is. That'll give you a way to focus on improving it. When you do that, I would then be aware of what is speaking out to you when you change this. If you start doing this and noting, hopefully you have better rhythm than I do. I have no musical genes in my body, so I have zero rhythm. So a metronome, sometimes I have to go by the visual more than the beat. But if you start changing that and you do get more symmetry, and you can use your wearable device while you're doing it to give you a little feedback there, start to observe what you notice. Do you start feeling a little bit more sore in your left quad? Do you feel your glutes kicking in a little bit more? Is your calf sore? That might give you a little indication of what's changing when you change that your body may be unintentionally or unconsciously adapting to. So that could give you some ideas if you don't have access to a running specialist that can really help you figure out what's going on and why your ground contact time is asymmetrical. That'll give you maybe some clues about what some things are that you can help to do to change it. You still need to do the gait retraining. We talk a lot about this in our certified running gait analyst courses, that mobility is not ability and stability is not ability. And what that means is you can't just stretch something and expect your form to change, or you can't just strengthen a muscle and expect your form to change. You need to actually do the gait retraining. So even if you identify that left quad weakness is why you have ground contact time asymmetry, if you're not retraining it and improving your symmetry, it's not just going to magically improve on its own. You actually have to go in and look to change your form and improve it in that manner too. The other thing I would say, because we talked about stiffness as well, if somebody is really looking to improve their ground contact time, one of the things I will do, we have an assessment called loading levels that we do at Run DNA. And this is basically a way that we can understand where you are at from your ability to participate in plyometric activities. And that is prescriptive in nature to be able to tell you that maybe you want to start doing some very basic plyometric activities, or you might be ready for more advanced plyometrics. But incorporating jumping into your training program can be a way that you can improve your stiffness, and kind of secondary benefit wise, you might be seeing a reduction in ground contact time for this. I know this is something I've done with very high level athletes, where I've seen that their loading levels is poor, their ground contact time is high for what I would expect for the level of athlete. These are typically talking about sub 4 minute mile folks there. But even in recreational runners, we see the same thing. I think they have even more to gain by incorporating plyometrics. We'll see larger gains because there's a little bit more opportunity for growth there. So I would say getting somebody to help you assist in adding jumping and plyometrics is a great way to also look at some of these ground contact time. If you're just looking to lower both sides, if you want to get at that 200 to 220 range or less, incorporating plyometrics in. If you have asymmetry, the type of plyometrics might also be helpful, where you are adding in single leg plyometrics to see if you can improve some of the symmetry with this. I would just urge people to also not get obsessive with some of this data. Remember the limitations of what we can measure with our devices there. I think that wearable devices give a good, reliable method for ground contact time, but it's going to be different from a 3D motion analysis, and you're going to see differences from device to device there. So make sure you incorporate that in and think about it, and don't be obsessive about this number. There are lots of things about your running form. This is, again, one of those what's happening numbers, but it's not really telling you why. So get evaluated, get a gait analysis, use our Run DNA, find a provider, and see if there's somebody in your area that can help you look at this and put the pieces of the puzzle together so that you can understand why you might have an asymmetry or why those numbers might be high. So definitely check that out. And then one more before we kind of wrap up here. I've had a debate more than once with a couple different providers here about, especially on the professional side. This is not necessarily a worry from a more recreational runner here, but on the professional side, is there such a thing as too little ground contact time? Can you get too low with this? And I'm a little bit in the camp that there could be too low of a ground contact time, because there's a certain amount of passive nature that we need from running to help us with forward propulsion. And what that means is when our foot hits the ground, our body can absorb a lot of forces in the first half of stance phase. And then we can see that a healthy body can return 95% of that energy absorbed in the first half of stance in the second half, when we're now talking more of propulsion. So if your ground contact time is too low, you could potentially reduce some of the benefits of your body to benefit from that passive nature, returning what you've absorbed in that absorption phase of stance. So I would love to hear what people think. I'd love to hear some other thoughts. Could it be too low? I have evaluated some of the fastest runners in the world with our 3D, and I do see they all typically get to a certain low point, and I don't see the faster they get, even world record holders that I've worked with or national record holders, they're not necessarily much lower, if at all, or they might even be a little higher sometimes compared to their counterparts that are maybe in the top 20 in the world, as opposed to being in the top 1 in the world there. So it's an interesting metric from a performance. And if you want to get nerdy with me and talk a little bit about that, please leave some comments. I'd love to hear what you thought about that, and if there's anything that you've seen or observed with that, or if you think there can be too much of a good thing with ground contact time. So just summing up, ground contact time is a very interesting metric. It is widely available. The reliability is good. The inter-rater reliability is not as good between devices. You're definitely going to want to trust the 3D analysis more than you would trust the watch for that. And those challenges come from really how you define the point at which the foot comes off the ground. So that's why there's variability, but it's still a valuable metric, and it should be pretty reliable within itself. So check it out. Start to see where you're at generally. Don't worry if it's too low. Like I said, my ground contact time with 3D is much lower than it is on my watch. So I'm not always trying to reduce my ground contact time, but I will look at the symmetry of that. And especially now with the article that we talked about, how even 1% can have a pretty significant change in the caloric expenditure or running economy that we are using when we're running. So hope this is helpful. We got more of the running metrics coming up. Please let us know. Love to hear from you, other things you're looking for, but hope everyone has happy running, and thanks for listening today.
Like what you hear? Leave a review of the show wherever you listen, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Run DNA helps runners and running specialists through education and technology to identify each runner's unique injury profile to avoid setbacks and maximize results. The Run DNA podcast is produced by Ace Running LLC. The Run DNA podcast is intended for educational purposes only. No clinical decision-making should be based solely on one source. While care is taken to ensure accuracy, factual errors can occur. Always seek the guidance of qualified medical professionals before making healthcare decisions. Find us online at rundna.com.